It's like a scene from E.T. or Stranger Things. Government officials, some of them wearing ventilated protective suits, going into the backyard of your neighbor's house. It's the house of that one strange kid who's always wearing a gas mask and brings a Geiger counter to school to test the radioactivity of the cafeteria food. You ask the government officials what's wrong, but they give little information, except to not be worried. But the resounding noise of power tools and strong vacuums echoing through the night give you little reassurance. Plus, they keep carting off barrel after barrel branded with radiation labels on them. You and the other neighbors wonder, what did that kid get up to in his backyard? David Hahn's life, though tragic, was an extremely fascinating one, filled with secrecy, life-threatening danger, and an obsessive quest for knowledge that culminated in his unfortunate end. Although his potential for greatness went unrealized due to a reckless abandon that cut his life short, his genius allowed him to accomplish things that no one even dreamed possible. Ever heard of the term, "don't try this at home"?
Hey bro, where's your Bunsen burners and test tubes and stuff?
In the hallway closet.
Thank you.
There's a reason why information can be dangerous. In the wrong hands, it can be life-threatening. Some are adamantly against the idea of censorship, but most can agree that teaching a teenager how to make a chemical weapon used in World War II is not a good idea, especially if you leave them with this information unsupervised. Surprisingly, that's where our story begins, when David Hahn was handed a book that was absolutely not appropriate for children. It sent him down a path that not only put him in danger, but also his entire neighborhood.
I'm okay.
What are you doing?
Just a little experiment.
Oh, as an example for the video?
What? Oh, I didn't realize you were doing one. Nah, I'm just trying to replicate my precious Yeet energy drink formula. Some guy on the internet says he discovered it.
Nothing that starts with some guy on the internet ever ends well.
You are some guy on the internet.
Yes, but I'm warning people against doing experiments in their home. This story is a perfect cautionary tale. Grill, please don't destroy the kitchen.
I won't destroy it any more than it already is. But just in case, where's the fire extinguisher?
David Hahn was born on October 30th, 1976 in Royal Oak, Michigan. He was always a curious child. In one of his earliest experiments, at just 4 years old, he combined creams and liquids from the bathroom in a small bowl, including drain cleaner, in hopes of getting a magical reaction. He did. It bubbled violently and almost boiled over. Worried, he flushed it down the toilet so his parents wouldn't find out. This, as you'll learn, would be a dangerous pattern for David. He got away with many of these experiments because his parents often left him unsupervised. His father, Ken, worked long hours as a mechanical engineer. His mother, Patty, while very loving and present, had a drinking problem and was medicated for depression and paranoid schizophrenia. Eventually, David's parents divorced in 1985, when he was 9. Ken remarried to a woman named Kathy and got custody of David, while he would stay with his mother and her boyfriend on weekends and holidays, about an hour drive from his father's place. With these new arrangements, according to David, the caring went away. David's adventures ramped up when his stepmother's father gifted him the Golden Book of Chemistry Experiments at around the age of 10. It was a colorful children's chemistry book from the 1960s with drawings and exciting experiments, like how to make chlorine gas and other deadly, toxic, or corrosive substances.
Man, people were so hardcore in the past.
It definitely makes lawn darts look tame. By this point, David had already built things such as electronics and small homemade explosives that he blew up at the bottom of his empty pool. So, this volatile book, like a stray neutron, only gave the hyperactive kid the means to cause more chaos, like a chain reaction that nobody saw coming. David was gaining a reputation as a strange kid. Anytime he would converse with someone, he always found a way to divert the subject to the dozen experiments he was conducting simultaneously, many of them from the Golden Book. One time he made chloroform, and as per the book, in red lettering it said, "Sniff carefully to notice the peculiar Swedish odor." So David leaned over and took a big sniff. He immediately blacked out and fell to the floor. He woke up about an hour later, dazed and confused, before realizing what had happened. He kept that incident from his parents, something that he got good at as time went on and his experiments grew more dangerous. It was obvious from the labs at his two respective homes that safety wasn't a priority for David. His bedroom at his father's and the potting shed at his mother's were covered in pockmarks and stains from chemical reactions gone wrong. It was also obvious from his appearance as well, because supposedly, one time a chemical mishap left his face beet red and his hair bright orange. but David also claimed it was from an overdose of steroids he ordered for a self-tanning experiment. He produced hair dye at home, and one time after experimenting over the weekend, was unable to clean it off. He went to school on Monday with multicolored hair of green, brown, and black. He was teased for it, and girls fired spitballs at him during English class. What was most strange of all was that while he showed an exceptional passion for chemistry, he struggled in school. He was often distracted, got a lot of C's and D's, and had a lot of difficulty spelling words. He didn't do well at sports either. Unless it was about his obsession with science and making things go boom, he often showed little care. But expectedly, he excelled in his science classes. He had a bit of an ego too, and was known for interjecting in class when it was a subject he knew well. During a lecture on acids and bases, he interrupted his biology teacher so much that in a defeated tone, she asked if he would like to finish the lecture. And, well, he did.
Man, this guy is like my multiverse nerdy alternate.
Data analyzed, confirmed. You both are impulsive and seemingly unable to comprehend the potential consequences of your actions. And despite his educational deficiencies, I calculate a high probability that his intellect levels are monumental in comparison to your suboptimal neural network you claim is a mind.
Hey, I'm smart. According to my calculations, you're a coffee machine.
Comeback efficiency 0.00. Reattempting is not advised.
While his parents never fully understood what he was doing, they weren't completely oblivious. His stepmother was the most worried, as his bedroom became more riddled with pockmarks, and there were chemical stains on the carpet and walls. Kathy, knowing she had little sway with David, forced his father Ken to take action. First, they gave David space in the basement where he could cause less damage. Then, Ken convinced David to join the Boy Scouts to learn discipline, hoping it would also distract him from his experiments. Unfortunately, it did the opposite. One evening, Ken and Kathy were relaxing, watching TV, when a boom shook the house violently. They sprinted downstairs to find David semi-conscious with singed eyebrows. He had been hammering a red phosphorus chunk for a rocket project, unaware that heavy impacts ignited the substance. He hadn't been wearing goggles as safety was rarely on David's mind, so he was rushed to the hospital to have his eyes flushed. He spent several weeks after that visiting the ophthalmologist to pluck debris out of his eyes. One eye had impaired vision for a full year after that. This was the last straw for Kathy. She told Ken it was either David's lab or her, so David was now limited to doing experiments only at his mother's place on the weekends. His mother Patty knew nothing of the red phosphorus incident since she and Ken never talked. This lack of communication between households would prove to be extremely dangerous later on. Do you have to do that here?
What? I want to listen to the story. Oof. All right. Step 5 of 100 done.
There was one particular story in the Golden Book that stuck with David. It was about Pierre and Marie Curie and their discovery of radium. The drawing of the couple shows them working in their drafty shed, bathed in the glow of radium. It reminded David of his lab in the potting shed, where he always felt in his element. While the Golden Book didn't have any radioactive experiments, his new heroes, the Curies, launched his focus in a new and deadly direction. Ken convinced David to become an Eagle Scout, the highest achievement in Boy Scouts, where one needed to accomplish several tasks, including earning 21 merit badges. So it was no surprise when David chose to pursue the Atomic Energy Badge. The requirements were child's play for him, which included building a Geiger counter from a kit, making models of various atomic elements, and constructing a model nuclear reactor out of a juice can, pill bottles, clothes hangers, straws, matches, and rubber bands. He got his badge in 1991 when he was 14. The models were so detailed, and he went so above and beyond with his tasks, that his counselor joked that David should have earned 3 Atomic Energy Merit Badges. It was during the pursuit of this badge, reading the Atomic Energy Merit Badge pamphlet, where David learned that many household items contained radioactive materials. A light bulb glowed green in his head. David's obsessive nature turned to collecting every single radioactive element, a goal he would do anything to achieve. He needed some expert advice to obtain the 38 elements and knew that if he asked his teachers, they might try to stop him. So he contacted various nuclear organizations by mail, pretending to be Professor David Hahn. It didn't work too well, since he often misspelled words in the letters. Despite this, the biggest breakthrough for David was when he received a letter from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, a government agency put in place to ensure the safe use of radioactive materials for commercial purposes. Which is ironic, since they gave David, a 16-year-old boy, a list of where to obtain many radioactive materials from everyday items. So, he went on a hunt to acquire those materials. He got polonium from electrostatic brushes, thorium from gas lantern mantles, and radium from old clocks. During a camping trip, while most of the Boy Scouts were focused on sneaking into a Girl Scout camp, David went to work stealing smoke detectors from empty cabins to get the radioactive americium within. It wasn't as if he had no interest in girls, though. In fact, he had a girlfriend at the time, Heather. When he wasn't obsessing over radioactive elements, he was writing her love letters and going on dates. While they had chemistry, Heather did have a hard time dealing with David's eccentricities. He would sometimes spend a whole dinner explaining the chemical makeup of his food, despite her annoyance.
I do enjoy a good chemical composition. Coffee contains citric acid, fructose, glucose, arabinose, polymers of galactose, mannose, arabinose.
Yep, that's annoying.
Well, science was how David coped with the world, and how he built up his confidence. But his obsession with it not only aggravated people, but it would also end up putting them in grave danger.
And of course, caffeine.
Oh, caffeine! That's my next ingredient. So, how does Brew do this? Uno cafe, por favor.
Password.
Bro, what's the password?
There is no password.
There is no password.
There is now that I fortified my security with NordVPN, this video's sponsor.
Listen, I just need some
Information on how to become safer online with the fastest VPN on the entire planet? Understood? NordVPN offers the ability to mask your digital footprint by selecting a remote country, rendering your location an enigma to prying eyes. But it is also a digital sentinel standing by your side, securing your online existence in numerous ways.
Listen, you glorified tin can, I'm not playing.
With fire, you are if you are using other VPNs, because they rely solely on rudimentary DNS filters. NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro can shield you from various online threats. Beyond other VPNs, it scans downloaded files for nefarious code and blocks websites that are designed to corrupt your device or lure you into a fraudulent trap, amongst other things.
Ugh, you're impossible.
Possibly handsome and well protected, I agree. With dangers lurking around every corner, it would be unwise to browse the World Wide Web without NordVPN joining you on your quest. Puny humans may receive an exclusive NordVPN deal plus 4 months extra by engaging with our URL, nordvpn.com/brew. It is danger-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee.
You know what? Whatever. I'll just extract some caffeine from the instant coffee in the kitchen.
Do we have instant?
Never in this house.
Too bad David's parents never said anything like that to him. It might have kept this story from having such a tragic ending. At the age of 16, David was reading one of his father's old textbooks, a usual pastime for him, when he stumbled upon something that would put his life and all the lives of the people in his neighborhood in jeopardy. A breeder reactor. Typical nuclear reactors, like other energy sources, heat water that spins a turbine which generates electricity. What makes reactors different is the heat source. Uranium-235 atoms are hit by a neutron, and as it absorbs this neutron, it splits. This releases energy in the form of heat, as well as more neutrons, which get absorbed by other atoms, causing a chain reaction. If left alone, it will cause a meltdown. That's why control rods are used to absorb neutrons, and water is used to slow them down as well as cool down the reactor. Breeder reactors not only produce heat via a chain reaction, they also breed more fissionable material than they use, making them very sustainable, requiring far less refueling. David saw breeder reactors as the future and now had a passion for building one. The only problem was that breeder projects in the past had experienced a slew of issues, some of which being of the catastrophic variety. A fact that David was tragically unaware of because he purposely read only positive stories about radioactivity and actively avoided negative ones. The irony of this would only come to David later in life, as his own story would fall into the latter category. This is likely why he paid little attention to safety measures. He did have a lead-lined suit he used when handling radioactive materials, but it was torn in a few places, and he didn't wear it all the time, like on hot days. David told his few friends at school about his desire to build a reactor, but they didn't think a 16-year-old could pull it off. He was insistent on proving them wrong, believing he would one day be a great scientist who made it into the history books, like his heroes, the Curies.
Well, this guy is already my hero.
He's not someone you should be emulating.
Now fold in the cheese. What does fold in the cheese mean? Why cheese? Oh, that's the recipe for my mom's enchiladas. Now stir in chromo chloride. Oh, that makes more sense.
Are you sure this will be safe to drink?
Well, if it's anything like the original, it won't be.
To construct his nuclear reactor, first David tried to obtain some uranium-238 for the core. He noted on the NRC list that 2 firms in the Czech Republic sold small uranium samples. They didn't sell to non-commercial or non-education institutions. So, under the guise of Professor David Hahn, he bought some samples. David tried his best to separate the uranium-238 from the samples by first smashing it with a hammer, boiling the crushed rocks with chemicals, and then straining with a coffee filter into a beaker. He ended up with a dirty milkshake that wasn't going to bring any boys to the yard. Unless, of course, those boys were part of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency.
Analysis, it exceeds yours. Confirmation, it exceeds yours. I can teach you, but I have to charge.
If his attempt to separate the uranium succeeded, firing neutrons at it would produce plutonium, an excellent fuel for atomic energy and the material used in the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Unsure if his milkshake or uranium was enough, he decided to seek out more fissionable material for the core. He had already acquired some thorium from gas lantern mantles, but needed more, so he drove his Pontiac behind a camping equipment store to buy some boxes of mantles from an employee that were conveniently missing from the store inventory. His hope was to breed the thorium-232 into uranium-233, an excellent fissile fuel material. The problem was, in that process it also produces byproducts that emit gamma radiation, the most penetrating and one of the most dangerous types of radiation. It could pass through the whole body, damaging DNA along the way, and David either didn't know or didn't care.
Okay, maybe he is a little careless. Even I'm not that bad.
Shouldn't you have a fume hood?
It's fine. It's all fine. Maybe just, don't breathe for like 10 minutes?
David then needed a neutron source, so he went on a hunt in junkyards and antique shops with a Geiger counter in hand and collected a few old clocks that used radium and zinc sulfide to glow in the dark. David took the radium, placed it into a cavity that he dug out of a lead block, and then made a hole with a pin to make his neutron gun. He then placed his uranium milkshake and some thorium in a fuel-lined bowl in front of his neutron gun, wrapped it all in a dome of a thin sheet of lead, and left it there for a few days. When he came back and tested it with his Geiger counter, he noticed only a slight increase in radioactivity. It wasn't working. David figured out, as the scientists in the Manhattan Project realized, that the neutrons were traveling too fast to be absorbed by the uranium. It's why nuclear reactors use water as a medium to slow them down. David could use water, but realized a better substance was radioactive tritium, so he checked his NRC list to see where he could get some, and found out it was used in night vision gun sights. David ordered a few gun sights via the mail. With dish gloves on, he used coffee stirrers to scrape out the yellow waxy tritium into perfume bottles. In one instance, he forgot a coffee stirrer on his nightstand and placed his watch on it before going to bed. The next day, he wore it and felt a burn at the end of the day, realizing his mistake. David showed little concern for the radiation burn and just put ointment on it. Luckily, tritium only emits beta radiation, which doesn't penetrate deep into the body, only causing burns. However, with how careless he was and the proximity of the tritium to his hands, he may have gotten some on his food or on his face. And it's much more dangerous if inhaled or ingested. Then, when David was done with the sights, he would return them, claiming that they were defective. The plan didn't always work though. When David borrowed a few sights from a local gun and ammo shop for a demonstration and returned them no longer functioning, the owner forced his father to pay it back. At this point, Ken really should have seen this as a red flag to what his son was doing, but all he did was force David to pay the store owner back the $400 owed.
Seriously, his parents really needed to clue in.
It could be that they just underestimated how dangerous his plans actually were. But for David, it was worth it, because now, when he tested his setup with the tritium, he was reading higher radiation levels. This meant the now 17-year-old could finally attempt to build his breeder reactor. First, he did what anybody would do with highly radioactive radium and americium that he took from some smoke detectors. He filed and pulverized it, which probably sent radioactive dust into the air. It's not clear if he was wearing any protective equipment, but with his track record, it was a safe bet he wasn't.
Well, that doesn't seem remotely safe. That was supposed to happen.
Why aren't you wearing any safety glasses or gloves?
That's for wimps. David clearly didn't need any of those things.
Oh, he did. He just didn't realize it yet. Next, David mixed the radioactive dust with beryllium strips and aluminum shavings, and then wrapped it all in an aluminum foil ball. This was his core, theoretically meant to mimic a normal reactor core in a nuclear power plant, which would emit his neutrons. For the next layer, David placed 3mm thick cubes of thorium and some uranium-238 wrapped in foil. Then, for the outer layer, he placed bullion-sized cubes of thorium in an alternating checkerboard pattern with carbon cubes to help multiply the neutrons. This is what's known as a breeder blanket, the material that's meant to capture the extra neutrons, and what would make it a breeder reactor, which, in turn, would emit deadly gamma radiation. After wrapping it all in duct tape, David now had something the size of a basketball and weighed about 1 kilogram. But you wouldn't want to throw 3 pointers with this.
Yeah, would give a whole new meaning to nuclear meltdown on the court. Am I right?
Is that a basketball term?
I don't know.
As he observed the radiation over a few weeks, it was, as David described, radioactive as heck. While it was nuclear as crystal that the neutrons were doing something to the fissionable material, he wasn't sure if the materials were being bred into plutonium and uranium-233, which emits dangerous gamma rays. But regardless, David had built his reactor and in a sense mirrored what his heroes, the Curies, had done in their shed. But would he mirror them in more ways than one? After all, Marie Curie died because of her exposure to radiation, a fact that David was likely aware of, but decided not to take as a warning. While David was elated with his accomplishment, something horrible dawned on him. He didn't have an off switch for the reactor, something he had to remedy quickly because his reactor was no longer just radioactive as heck. After confiding in one of his few friends about the miniature Chernobyl disaster brewing in his backyard, they reminded him about control rods. It was one of the essential components of any nuclear reactor to absorb neutrons and prevent a meltdown. So David rushed to the hardware store, bought cobalt drill bits, since cobalt absorbs neutrons, and wrapped the 8 bits in wire which he placed into the reactor ball. But it didn't work. It wasn't just highly radioactive now, it was getting worse. He was now registering far beyond background radiation, well before he got to his backyard. It was no longer a danger to only himself. David was never one to be concerned about safety, but when a few days later the needle on his Geiger counter went wild even 5 houses down from his mother's house, he knew that he might be on the verge of killing everyone in the neighborhood.
Uh-oh.
I know, pretty frightening.
No, I mean, uh-oh. I'm all right.
It was about this time when David came across one of the negative stories about radiation that he had previously avoided. It was about the Radium Girls, a story that we've actually covered in a previous video. These women worked in a watch factory where they painted radium onto watch dials, licking the brushes for a better tip. They slowly died in horrifying ways due to the radioactive radium they were ingesting, the very same radium that David had been scraping off of clock dials. David explained, "I knew in theory that radium could be dangerous, but I'd never read about what had happened to people who handled it. I was pretty much scared to death." He knew he needed to do something fast, but in secret, as always.
Come on, just tell someone. Jeez. This is like when you watch a horror movie and yell at the screen, "Get off your phone, Janice! The killer's right behind you!"
David needed to shut down his experiment or risk putting the lives of himself and the entire neighborhood in danger. So, wearing a gas mask and gloves, he began disassembling his reactor and placing thorium cubes and ash into a shoebox, glass jars, and milk jugs, which he then stored in his closet and basement. However, he was unable to fully disassemble the reactor before it was time to head back to his father's place. So he put the remainder of the highly radioactive core cubes into a red toolbox, duct taped it shut, and put it in the trunk of his Pontiac before driving to his father's. This would prove to be a monumental mistake for David. At 2:40 a.m. the following morning, David was sitting in his car in a residential neighborhood.
Yeah, that's not sus at all. What was he doing?
The author of The Radioactive Boy Scout would later state, It never became clear what exactly David was doing in his car at that late hour, but unfortunately for David, someone had reported a young man in the area stealing tires. When police went to investigate, they found David alone in his Pontiac, claiming he was waiting for a friend. It was unclear if David was that young man in the report, but they decided to search his car regardless. As they asked him to open his trunk, they fully expected to find tires. They instead found what was likely the most alarming assortment of things these officers had ever seen. Fireworks, chemicals, acids, cylindrical metal objects, a red toolbox duct taped shut, and 50 cubes of a mysterious gray powder wrapped in foil. David wasn't too cooperative, but he at least warned the officers that there was radioactive material. The police didn't really understand what they had on their hands, but a duct-taped red toolbox and radioactive material led them to one conclusion: a nuclear bomb. So they arrested David and they towed his car to the police headquarters.
That's not exactly a smart move. Hey, there's a bomb. Okay, let's bring it back to the police station.
Yeah, maybe not the smartest move, but at least it wasn't in the middle of a residential neighborhood. While David was behind bars, they questioned his father, who was oblivious to everything going on. But the police wanted to know how David got a hold of all that radioactive material, which shouldn't be easy to come by, especially for a 17-year-old. Meanwhile, David was still uncooperative with the police, which didn't help the situation. His secretive nature kept making everything worse for him and the people around him. The bomb squad in the Department of Public Health's Radiological Division sent teams immediately. They determined that it wasn't a bomb, to their relief. However, after tests were done, they discovered worrying levels of radiation from the cubes. This triggered the Federal Radiological Emergency Response Plan, which is designed to evacuate or contain the affected area in case the radioactivity is dangerous. David lied and said it was the only radioactive material he had. Not exactly willing to just take his word for it, they went to his father's house and found no radioactivity. However, they were unaware of his second home, believing that Kathy was his mother, not his stepmother. In the end, the police wanted to charge David with illegal possession of explosives, but ultimately, they had nothing on him and had to let him go. Dave Minar, the head of the radiological division of the DPH, was never satisfied with David's answers for how or why he obtained the radioactive materials, and the safety measures taken, or rather, the lack thereof. But due to other emergencies, it was a whole 3 months before Minar eventually called David to clear things up. David was vague during this call and claimed he was doing a project to earn his Eagle Scout status. The same lie he told his father. Unsatisfied, Minar called again, but this time Ken answered and explained that David was at his mother's. This was the first that Minar had heard of a second home, and sirens went off in his head. Minar called David at his mother's house immediately. Realizing the jig was up, David confessed, revealing the nuclear reactor he tried to build in the potting shed. David told his mother and her boyfriend, avoiding the subject of his arrest and the reactor, but telling them what he believed was enough. Not being well off and worried they might lose their home, they went to work gathering up all of his radioactive materials, including the most dangerous of them, the radium and the thorium, and threw them in the city trash. From there, the radioactive materials made their way to the landfill to forever be lost.
Yeesh. Makes you wonder what you'll find at a landfill.
Just like with toxic materials, it's never a safe way to dispose of radioactive waste. The radioactivity might not only expose city workers, but it could find its way into the environment through leaching and end up contaminating surface or groundwater. As the Department of Public Health officials arrived at the home, Patty finally learned about the arrest and the reactor. She was shocked. David's talent seemed to not only be in the sciences, but also in secrets. The officials walked around the home with Geiger counters and found a surprising amount of radiation from out back. Levels 10 times that of normal background radiation were found within the potting shed. But officials were more concerned about David's hammering and explosions, which could have contaminated the neighborhood with radioactive dust that was capable of weakening one's immune system and causing a variety of health problems like cancer and ultimately death. So the EPA stepped in and declared David's potting shed laboratory a Superfund site, like the Exxon oil spill, padlocking the shed and surrounding it in yellow tape. While David hunkered down at his grandmother's, 3 people in ventilated moon suits cut away at the shed with electric hacksaws and vacuum surfaces to collect any radioactive dust that may have contaminated the area. The makeshift lab, made of tin cans, bowls, car parts, and other junk, were placed into barrels alongside the shed planks and then sealed. But this wasn't a one-day cleanup, and eventually, reporters were tipped to the situation by a neighbor. The EPA refused to give information at first, but when they finally did, they revealed very little. Just that a teenager was experimenting with radioactive materials he got from household items. While they never revealed the teenager's name, it was obvious to neighbors. Who else other than the strange and science-obsessed David Hahn? After 3 days, 39 sealed barrels were loaded onto a semi-truck and sent away to be entombed at a dump facility in the middle of the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. His project reached its full decay, but David's fate was still hanging in the balance. While David was lucky to not face any criminal charges, Ken, enraged that his son lied to him, almost had his own nuclear meltdown. So he took away David's car keys and grounded him, but only for 2 weeks. David became depressed. His life's work, even the logbooks of his experiments, were buried somewhere in the desert.
As messed up as that experiment was, that's sad.
Yeah, for a teenager, that must have felt like everything to him. While his mental health took a toll, his physical health was of concern as well. The EPA advised David to get a full body count of his radiation levels at the Fermi plant, a research facility and failed breeder reactor plant. But David backed out last minute, fearful of the results. He didn't want to find out that he had become one of those negative stories about radiation that he had tried so hard to ignore. He tried to avoid disaster, but it would inevitably catch up to him. As for the neighbors, luckily nobody reported having any health issues associated with radioactive dust, or they may have suffered from health problems and just not understood the source. But many of them did hear about David's exploits. While he was saddened by the loss of his lab, the radioactive Boy Scout, as he was nicknamed, was glowing from the fame. It seemed half the city knew of him as a mad scientist by now. But just in case, he walked around with photocopies of his news articles and handed them out to random students at schools, then walked away without saying a word. David explained, "I really liked giving the stories to kids who were always saying I was just making everything up."
Man, what an I told you so. See, I told you I almost killed all my neighbors.
Well, after the incident, David tried to live a normal life. He finished the requirements he needed to get his Eagle Scout status, which made his father proud. Yet some local scout leaders tried to strip him of his status because he had stolen, lied, and put others in danger. While his status remained, it brought to light what much of the community thought about David's exploits. But then, things got worse for David. His girlfriend Heather broke up with him as they were just too different from each other. She tried to be friends, but after he began stalking her, she cut all ties. Then came a tragic day when his mother, who struggled with her own mental well-being, ended her own life. The only parent who showered him with support was now gone. David said, "When my mother and Heather left, I felt as if I was being punished by God. All hope vanished from my life." From this point forward, David wandered through life like a neutron looking for an atom to split. He tried to get a degree in metallurgy but failed for skipping too many classes. He joined the Navy, where he hoped to take part in the engineering training program, but they denied him entry. After his tour, he tried to get another degree in applied sciences, but failed at that as well. Then he joined the Marines for a few years, achieved the rank of Lance Corporal, but was honorably discharged on medical grounds. Why is unclear.
Quite the career path.
Despite everything that happened, his nuclear aspirations were still as radiant as ever, and after his naval tour, he went on a trip up to Canada in hopes of mining uranium at an abandoned uranium mine.
Man, this guy never quits.
Nope. Which is why in 2007, the FBI got a tip that David had a neutron source in his freezer and was collecting radium to build a reactor again. So they brought him in for an interview. The FBI report revealed that David had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, like his mother, and was not taking his medications. He had also become a heavy user of illegal narcotics. But after the interview and a check of his apartment with no signs of radiation levels, they determined he wasn't building a reactor. In the same year, David was charged with larceny for allegedly removing the smoke detectors from the halls of his apartment building to obtain the americium. As he had done at scout camp, his mugshot showed a face full of sores, but it was unclear if it was from radiation or drug use. But regardless, it was clear his body was taking a toll. He was sentenced to 90 days in jail after going for psychiatric treatment. And on September 27, 2016, David passed away at only 39 years old. Many thought he would have succumbed to the radiation, especially if he was still collecting radioactive substances in his later years. But it was ruled an accidental death from the intoxication of alcohol, fentanyl, and diphenhydramine, an antihistamine. Although it probably never bred any uranium, David Hahn's reactor was successful in penetrating the thorium. And whether you think of him as a mad scientist who was unconcerned with consequences or a genius without proper guidance, I think we can all agree this was quite a feat for a 17-year-old. David's life was without direction and wrought with turmoil. But what's clear is that he was never happier than when he was in his potting shed, tinkering away at his radioactive materials, hoping to go down in the history books like his heroes.
Hey, tell me how this tastes.
Is it safe?
Have I ever steered you wrong?
All the time, constantly, every day.
You lack anything resembling a metaphorical GPS in your life.
Fine. Oh God, it burns! I feel like I'm gonna die! It's perfect. Yeah, that's the stuff.
Let's have something a bit less toxic. One coffee, please, Howard.
Password.
Right, the password. Thank you, NordVPN, for sponsoring this video and helping us to keep bringing content to our viewers. Don't forget to use our URL for an exclusive deal and 4 months extra, which you can find in the description below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button. It's the best thing you can do to help us keep making more videos. Like this one about the 14-year-old boy who became one of the FBI's most wanted after he vanished in front of 30 officers. Click the video on your screen to watch now.